I work in music retail. I sell lots of mics. I sell like mics and music equipment all day. And sometimes I get a call back from a customer that I sold a mic to that has no experience with it. And they're like, hey, this mic that you sold me sucks. And it's like, well, how are you using it? And they're like, oh, well, I'm trying to I can't get a good sound when I'm recording my ukulele and my voice. Okay, are you recording them separately or are you recording them at the same time? Like, well, I've got it like 3 feet away from me and it sounds really like roomy. And it's like, well, of course it's going to sound roomy. You've got no acoustic treatment, and then you're also not using it the way that it's intended. To get the best sound with this particular mic in this budget, you need to be pretty close to this mic to mitigate your room noise, especially since you don't have the budget to invest in some acoustic treatment. So then they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then they try it out, and they're like, oh, you're right, it's not a bad mic.
You're listening to the GWNL-Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Hello and welcome to GWNL-Podcast. This is episode 14. We've made it this far. I'm Joe.
I'm Ben.
And I'm Bryant.
You do not know how hard it is to get them to say this in like a reasonable amount of time. It's like herding cats here.
The delays.
Just got to make it as awkward as possible,
You're really good at, both of you are really good at that. Anyways, this is episode 14. What's the matter with my microphone? I don't know. They don't pay me to know that. But we're going to talk about microphone types. We're going to talk about some common problems, misconceptions, and other things. With that being said, Bryant, why don't you take it away? What's a transducer? Nobody asked, but now we're going to know.
Yeah, nobody asked what a transducer is, but in order to understand microphones, you need to talk about transducers. So microphones and speakers are both types of transducers, and a transducer just takes one form of energy and converts it into another form of energy. So in the case of a microphone, your capsule or your moving coil or your ribbon, which we'll talk about later, those are your transducers in a sense. Basically, they're taking sound pressure level, or SPL, and they're converting that into voltage. So voila, there is your transducer. In the case of speakers, it's the opposite. A speaker is taking voltage and converting that into sound pressure level.
The cool thing is it's actually, there's 3 forms of energy, because there's kinetic energy, because the diaphragm actually moves.
Yeah.
So it's like acoustic energy to kinetic energy, moving the diaphragm, and then to electric energy or voltage, and then reversed for the speaker. But it's kind of cool to think about that kinetic energy as one of them too, because you're physically moving something with the sound.
No, because I bring that up. That's a good point, because they have these cool subwoofers that are like mechanical subwoofers that are.
Did you just say subwoofer?
Awesome. Types of microphone?
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess that's me. So types of microphones, there's a bunch of types of microphones. There's a handful of ones that we use most of the time, but we have the dynamic moving coil, which is probably the most commonly used microphone.
SM57, SM58.
Yeah.
You've seen them a million times.
And we refer to it as a dynamic microphone, but it's really a dynamic moving coil. Then there's the dynamic ribbon, which we refer to as a ribbon mic, but it's also dynamic. So both of those are dynamic because they use the sound energy, that kinetic energy, to power the microphone. So they don't require any additional power to run them. And then we have the condenser microphone, which does require power. And then a subset of the condenser is the electret condenser, which does require a magnetized plate, but it's pre-magnetized, pre-charged. That's what the electret part is. And so it doesn't really get used in pro audio as much as it used to, now that phantom power has become pretty standardized. And then we have the piezo and contact mics, or PZM mics, or contact mics, as you say. And those you find them in acoustic guitars and floor mics and contact
They'll have them in
mics.
Pianos too.
Yeah.
Like the piano contact mics.
Yeah, on the underside of the piano lid. Those can be really cool sounding. So those are basically the ones. And then in condensers, a lot of people get confused because there's large diaphragm condensers and small diaphragm condensers, and there's differences between those, but they're still condenser microphones.
Right.
And then there's even like shotgun microphones, which are usually condensers but they have a very different pattern. So there's patterns, which is the pickup pattern of the microphone too, that confuses things. The directionality of the microphone.
And for some of these, like so with the shotgun mic, it has a very prolonged forward axis pickup pattern, which is why I don't know why they call it a shotgun mic. They should call it a sniper mic because like all of the other ones, it's like it's meant for longer distance. And like that's why you'll see so common usage for that kind of thing, like a shotgun mic is for like booms and boom microphones for movies. That's what you see. Like when you see the thing afterwards and you see the boom mic come down and hit somebody, that's probably a shotgun mic. And like in comedy and stuff.
Well, in most like shotgun mics are small diaphragm condensers, but it's usually the tubing that creates the pickup pattern on those. They'll have just like a normal cardioid pattern if it was just a smaller tubing, but they have this elongated tubing with like holes and stuff along the way and that shapes the pickup pattern.
So with that being said, some of those tricks that we can use to shape polar patterns and on microphones. So because this is a common thing. So with condensers that have like multi-patterns, so like the C414, U87s, U67s that have multiple patterns, what they're using is they're using multiple electrical diaphragms, if I remember correctly, and they're arranging them in specific patterns. And as you flip that switch, it is activating certain patterns. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's how it works, right?
Yeah, basically
it's like a cardioid.
Adding
it's like a cardioid subarray.
You're adding or subtracting the two diaphragms from each other.
Yeah. Right. No, I mean, like that's so like with a cardioid subarray, I'll explain it that way because I do that a lot as a live sound guy.
Yeah.
What they do is you have 3 subs. You have a center sub that is usually facing the opposite for the other 2 that are facing forward. That center sub is going to, or rear fire, it's like end fire, cardioid pattern, whatever. This same principle affects it. Subwoofers are omnidirectional speakers. They do not actually have a direction. And you need to create a direction to actually give it a cardioid facing, which is one of the types, common cardioid, hypercardioid, supercardioid. Most mics are of a cardioid persuasion. You set 1 facing back, 2 facing forward. You phase rotate the one that is facing back. And then you are pretty much like matching the amplitude of the rear-facing subwoofer to the amplitude of the front-facing ones. And it's based off of a specific frequency. So it's not just you point them in a different direction. You can do that, but it's going to be kind of a varying thing. You actually have to pick a specific low-end frequency. And it's actually more designed than just throwing it out there. And so you're going to pick a...
Sorry, this is a little bit too deep, I think. As far as
What?
we're going.
This is my favorite thing. I do this all the time. I love this. This is my bread and butter.
I know it's super cool, but
it's the concept of,
deep.
and we could get into deeper about how those multi-pattern microphones are working. But the main thing is you have your patterns. The most common one is cardioid, which is picking up from the front and rejecting in the back. And so...
hypercardioid is more pronounced. Supercardioid is also more pronounced. There's a little bit of a pickup in the rear for hyper and supercardioid, whereas cardioid doesn't.
Yeah, as they get tighter, they start to turn into a figure 8 or bidirectional microphone, pick up from the front and back. And then Omni just picks up from everywhere. So, but anyways, the patterns are less of a discussion in this one. But we know the types. The 3 main types that we deal with in both live sound and the studio are dynamics, or the dynamic moving coil, the ribbon or dynamic ribbon, the condenser, and those are the 3 main types. Dynamics get used a lot in live sound because of their durability
and rejection.
Yeah, because you move far away from them and they lose a lot of their.
Or if you move off axis,
Yeah.
and like you don't have to worry about bleed as much. That's your big battle on a stage. It's
Yeah,
bleed
and feedback.
Feedback,
So, whereas a condenser microphone, you step back 10 feet and it still picks you up pretty well. And so that's going to feed back more likely. Not to say that dynamic microphones don't get used in the studio, because they do all the time. And not to say that condenser microphones and ribbon microphones don't get used in live sound, because they do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, overheads for a drum. I'm going to use
that's the most
condenser.
common one. And then piano mics and And there's a lot
I've
of lead vocal mics that they have really tight patterns.
Well, concert bands.
Great
I've
sounding.
used condensers on an entire concert band, like the whole thing, except for maybe some of the higher SPL instruments I would use.
Yeah.
But I've done that. I've used condensers. I had like 32, 40 of them.
And there's some touring acts that will use like a Royer R121 ribbon mic for their guitar cabs while they're on tour.
Yo, that's a common thing. Ribbon mics for guitar cabs. Fun.
Yeah, they sound really good. So anyways, what are some common problems and misconceptions, Joe?
The SM7B, the Shure SM7B. This is, a lot of people see podcasters using those microphones. We were just having this discussion beforehand. Like, you look at the microphone, you see this, you're like, oh, wow, that's so nice. It's the microphone that makes them sound good. So the SM7B can kind of get a bad rap because it's okay, but it needs a lot of gain. It needs a lot of preamplifying gain.
Because it is. What type of mic is it, Joe?
I think it's a dynamic moving coil. Is that what it is?
I think so.
Large diaphragm
Dynamic moving
dynamic
coil.
mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so is the RE320. The RE320 is in the similar vein. It's just a cheaper version or a cheaper style like that. But the biggest reason why it gets a bad rap or people might not understand is that it's gain hungry is a term I've heard thrown around. Basically, you need more gain. Like, if you get your Scarlett Focusrite ISA Pre or like your 2i2, right? And you're going to plug
the 2i2.
Yeah, the 2i2, right. I was sorry, the ISA Pre, whatever.
That's a different pre. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a preamp. Anyways,
Yeah, but the
No, the
Scarlett,
2i2.
the 2i2 is pretty prolific. And there's tons of them out there.
but it's not got enough gain. It has clean gain out the gate, but it doesn't have enough gain in that package with a USB controller in that manner to run an SM7B properly. It's always just going to sound really quiet.
You'll find that as you start to drive your your in any sort of interface anyway, like around that level, if you're using an SM7B directly into the interfaces, stock pre's, you're going to find that you're going to get a lot of noise because you're going to be probably maxing out your gain there, and that'll bring up the self noise of the preamps. And so a lot of people are like, oh, it's a noisy mic, or oh, it doesn't get loud enough, and it doesn't get loud enough because it's a very low output mic. So in order to mitigate that, you have to use some sort of external pre. At the bare minimum, I usually recommend a cloud lifter, which gives you, I think, 15 or 25 dB of additional gain, and that allows you to kind of keep your preamp gain on your Scarlett or your PreSonus audio box around anywhere from around noon to about 3 o'clock.
Yeah, and that's I think we mentioned this in an earlier episode about that 75-80%. Any piece of gear, when you get around 75 to 80%, that's kind of the max that you want to run it at. As soon as you go higher than that, you're going to start to get more of that self noise, like Joe was just saying.
Bryant said that.
Oh, Bryant said that? Oh.
Same, but different.
The other guy,
I've brought it up in the past. I know that because, like, again, you're introducing more electronic through it. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to get into that. I already said it once. No, so that's why SM7Bs kind of get a little bit of a bad rap. And I've seen some people professionally that didn't understand and didn't know because they just didn't understand audio. They're not bad people. They just didn't know. And a lot of problems come from that. Also, remember, with dynamics, you're not going to get as far away from that microphone. So I'm using a dynamic microphone right now. Ben, you're using a condenser right now.
Yep.
Do you see how close I am to it? I'm literally on my microphone. I'm not that far away, and I will get closer into it. But you see Ben and the distance he's got, like a foot.
Yeah.
I'm like 2 or 3 inches.
I'm like a foot away, and I can move around, and I still get picked up pretty well. It does change. I'm off axis, and it does change the sound a little bit. But I can vary from a foot to a foot and a half and still sound pretty similar. Whereas if Joe goes back 6 inches, it's going to...
Yeah, so like this is me talking from, I think, roughly the same distance. Maybe a little bit further. I don't know. It's about the same.
Like a span and a half.
A span and a half. Okay, so like right about here. And I'm going to get on axis now. Right, so we're going to go right here. So like right about here, right? So this is now, I'm now at the same distance. How can you hear me?
Yeah,
we
we can hear you. Okay.
You're a lot softer.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm also compressing it too.
Yeah.
Well,
And then I'll
you
go
sound-
back to where now I'm where Joe was before.
Oh,
2
yeah,
inches
get a
away.
nice richness there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But anyways,
some of that proximity effect.
It does. And that's the thing, like with the SM7B, if you get off the mic, you get further away from the mic, it makes a huge difference.
And I use this
much
mic
more.
because I constantly am typing. Like I use this when I'm like playing games, when I'm not working or whatever. Or if like, it's really great because it rejects all that other noise that goes on my desk. And I can like, I'm fiddling with this thing, which is a camera holder. And I'm just playing with that right now. And I'm like tapping it over. And you might hear a little bit of that, but not nearly as bad as if I was running a condenser mic like Ben is. And
Now we
Brian, are you
know.
running a condenser?
Yeah, mine's a front address condenser though.
Okay.
Yeah, whereas mine's a side address. So you may think that you're going to speak into here, but you're actually speaking into this side here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also like kind of a common misconception about microphones is it a front address mic or is it a side address mic? And this is something common that I see with the Blue Yeti. A lot of people love getting the Blue Yeti, and then they think that it's a front address mic because of the way that it's designed. It looks like it's a front address mic. It is not a front address mic. It is a side address mic. And so you would be speaking into the side of it, not into the top of it.
There's also
like-
the Heil dynamic mics.
Oh,
the
yeah.
side
I know
kind
what
of
you're
thing,
talking about. Those things
where
are
they
cool.
look like they should be front address. I mean,
they're
they look
side
like they should be
address.
side address because they look like this, but it's their front
Yeah.
address. So yeah, I've seen people.
Yeah.
And even like the RE320s, like what Joe, I mean, that's not a 320? Is it a 320?
This is the 320
Oh,
because the
there's
RE20 is the original.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
an RE20. I've seen people on podcast things and stuff where they have the RE20 coming down, and it's like it's picking up from here, and they're talking at it maybe at the corner or something, and it's it's
Something.
like-
I mean, like,
Yeah.
there's a reason I'm speaking directly into it and fire, you know.
Also,
But,
something
yeah.
else to think about with kind of like common misconceptions with mics is also like your mic placement. I work in music retail. I sell lots of mics. I sell like mics and music equipment all day, and sometimes I get a call back from a customer that I sold a mic to that has no experience with it, and they're like, "Hey, this mic that you sold me sucks," and it's like, "Well, how are you using it?" And they're like, "Oh, well, I'm trying to I can't get a good sound when I'm recording my ukulele and my voice." Okay, are you recording them separately or are you recording them at the same time? Like, well, I've got it like 3 feet away from me and it just sounds really like roomy. And it's like, well, of course it's going to sound roomy. You've got no acoustic treatment and then you're also not using it the way that it's intended. To get the best sound with this particular mic in this budget, you need to be pretty close to this mic to mitigate your room noise, especially since you don't have the budget to invest in some acoustic treatment. So then they're like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." And then they try it out, and they're like, "Oh, you're right, it's not a bad mic." Like, yeah,
I mean,
I
there you have it. Somebody who works in retail who sells these things and is struggling. I mean, I have this issue too, where a lot of people come to me because I do live sound, and so like a simple rule of thumb that I give people is simply like what Bryant was saying. The closer you are, the more you're going to get the source. In this case, the source is the person making the noise or the instrument making the noise. Now, here's another thing. So I have to deal with this in live sound. Where do you mic a guitar, an acoustic guitar? This is a hot debated topic for some people, and for other people, there's only one answer. And
you don't
kinda
mic an
depends.
acoustic guitar. You give them a pickup and you DI it.
you plug them in, right?
I mean, if I was live, maybe, but like it doesn't sound the same. I'll be honest. Like,
Yeah, in the studio,
PSO.
definitely mic it up, but in
that's
live.
In live, no, I'm gonna DI that. I'm not an idiot. I'm gonna DI that thing. They want me to mic it. I'm like, why? You have a DI. We're using it anyway. So that got me off topic. But we used to do this hypothetical joke at my old job where we'd ask, "All right, how would you mic an elephant?" And the way that somebody answered that tells you a lot about how they approach mixing and how they approach recording and how they approach like live sound. Like, you know, like, okay, that's a weird situation. Like, why would you ever need to mic an elephant? Well, some people were like, well, I want to put a mic underneath their stomach because I want to get some of that rumble if they're going to trumpet out of their trunk. I want to have maybe a lavalier mic on the end of that trunk so I can hear like the high end frequencies of like the spittle leaving the dadgum nose. And there was a lot of different answers, and we were all engineers that worked together regularly. And so I use this as an example, and I use the acoustic guitar as an example because the best way to mic something is to listen, is to pay attention with your ear there, close to where you're going to be miking, and to listen to the recording. So this is why recording sessions can take longer than some people might realize, because you're listening for the best sound in that space and for that instrument and for that player. And it's not always as simple as, well, I always mic the acoustic guitar right by the bridge when I'm trying to... No, because sometimes you want to capture some other parts. Sometimes you want that fret noise more than you want the body of the sound. Sometimes you want the body of the sound more than the fret noise. So there's a lot of options.
And part of that also comes down to having a vision of the end product. If you know what you're wanting to do for the mix, you can use mic placement as a way to kind of pre-mix, basically pre-EQ, and in a sense, even do some compression, in a sense.
Yeah, and part of it is like the EQ concept is, you got to realize that first of all, we talked about these 3 different types of microphones. They all sound different than each other, and then within each of those types, there's varying like mics there's tons of different condenser mics and tons of different ribbons and tons of different dynamics, which all sound a little different than each other. The most pronounced way they sound different is their frequency response, or their like EQ contour, and so that's part of the thing to put into play. And then the other part is the instrument, and people don't realize that instruments and vocals, they don't just send off the full frequency range in every direction, or just your voice, that it's your full frequency range is coming straight out of your voice. Your whole body is an instrument. Your head's vibrating, your chest is resonating, and all of that together is creating the sound that we are familiar with as the sound of your voice. Same thing with a guitar, and they're sending off these frequencies in different directions. So where you place the microphone is going to capture those different frequencies, and then pairing a bright sounding mic with a dull sounding guitar, or vice versa, can give you different results, like Brian was saying.
Yeah, so like something that's pretty common when you're close miking violins, because you get harsh, usually you get some harshness from the bow on the strings on a violin. And so people, to tame that harshness, they will use a ribbon mic, because you get a nice, like, pleasing, smooth top end from ribbons in general. And that's in general. Of course, you can get like different sounds within different ribbon mics, but those are just in general terms. Has a smooth high end.
There are a couple things I want to bring up here. The first thing I want to kind of follow off of what Ben said, which is...
Yeah, I know you were like ready to say something.
I know, I'm still ready. I was just like...
I wasn't going to stop.
So this is what it feels like. This is what it feels like to be not me. Okay. So not to mention the fact that... like he was saying about your placement is going to affect the EQing and other things. But you also have to realize that as the sound leaves the source, leaves the body, leaves the instrument, it will change as it travels through the air, because sound has energy, and certain frequencies die faster than other frequencies when they're going through air or a wall. Like, that's why when you hear your neighbor downstairs and you hear things, you just hear, you hear all the low information out of that, right? So these are phenomenons that we see and we hear regularly. You have to realize that that still affects your recording in those situations. That's why moving the position closer, further away, and that matters. And it's different because, like, I know with trumpets, one of the biggest issues is you have a lot of like harshness. A lot of times they'll use ribbon mics to deal with that. Sometimes they'll just record with a condenser 5 to 10 feet away in a room that's completely treated and is managed. Those are techniques that they use, but they're not the answer to every problem. They're just techniques that are used. And so sometimes distance and space in a properly treated room is better. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to bring up is compliance. It's a term that they use. It's more of an electrical term than it is an actual like audio engineer term. All that means, all compliance means, is how readily, how fast or quickly the microphone will respond to the sound waves hitting it. So a good example is this. Dynamic microphones tend to be less compliant. What that means is they tend to need more gain in general to get the same bubble of sound that a condenser, like if you want to have the same distance bubble of sound that a condenser would have, you have to crank the gain a lot more on a dynamic microphone. Any microphone can, in theory, have the same distance of coverage, of reception, right? But depending on that gain and depending on other things. So dynamic mics tend to be less compliant, as in they are less compliant to respond to the noise, and condenser mics tend to be more compliant. Means they're more readily able to pick up sound frequencies and things, which is why a lot of people swear by dynamic microphone or by condenser microphones in the recording studio, where they're trying to capture like
the nuance.
Yeah, the nuance, all of that great stuff, and
get the spit.
Yeah, the ASMR. Oh gosh. But so those are the two things that I think are important as you consider these things. Now, ribbons, the reason, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more. So ribbons are less compliant. So what that means is they don't pick up some frequencies as easily. So like that's why they're used for things like trumpets and guitar cabs and other things with a lot of harsh high frequencies, because they're not as good at picking up those harsh and high frequencies, which is beneficial. That's what you were talking about with like, this is a dark mic. Yeah. They refer to it as smoothness because it automatically mitigates those things. Another way to mitigate that harsh frequency, distance in a space. But you have to have a good a good treated space to do that. And so that's why it's not so easy to use that technique. Mm-hmm. And so learning these kinds of things inform your decisions as you start recording things and tracking things. And it's important to remember those things. See, I can make good comments. Yeah. Y'all are sitting there and I'm like, just like, I want to say things.
No, but yeah, that compliance concept, I think even taking that further with that is the transient response. And that's something that gets discussed about microphones.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with those two dynamic microphones, dynamic ribbon and dynamic moving coil, is that concept that they're dynamic. And they're dynamic to the content going into them. So the energy that they put out is a relationship with the energy that's being put in. Whereas like a condenser microphone, you could whisper in it. And it's not going to really change like how much it picks up frequency response wise and how much it picks up like in the area. Whereas the dynamic mics will. And so the transient response is like how quickly those transients, when these big spikes happen in the sound, how quickly that gets captured by the microphone. And dynamic mics they're not as fast reacting to that transient response. They had this guy from one of the microphone companies demonstrate this, and he took a dynamic mic like diaphragm. He had the diaphragm. And he dropped that dynamic mic diaphragm from, his height. And it just fell to the ground like a potato chip. That's kind of how it was described, like a potato chip. Then he took a condenser diaphragm and he held it in the same spot and let it go. And it just kind of floated down in the air like a feather sort of thing. And if you think about that really thin membrane just quickly responding to whatever happens, whereas that potato chip has got to have some force to get it moving. And that's why dynamic mics are really good for explosive sounds. And ribbons are awesome because you can take and tone something down that's really transient and make it less transient. Like there's a great story of a famous song where they played sticks on bottles, and the engineer was wise enough to say, we're not going to record this with condenser microphone because all you're going to get is the really sharp transients. So he recorded it with a ribbon microphone, and then the ringiness of the bottle could come through more instead of just the sharp transient hits, because the ribbon wasn't as good picking up those transient hits.
So, and I think we're kind of getting at the point, which is that condensers and dynamics, there's not really one that's better. Like type of mic is not better. There are obviously better designed dynamic microphones and less better designed dynamics, and better condensers and less better condensers. Yeah. But that's not necessarily money related either. There are some, like again, I've heard the old thing, where like they had a blind test and they had some rock vocalist or whatever singing, and they had him go through like a whole list, like, you know, hot rodded microphones that are like tens of thousands of dollars, and they liked his voice best on an SM57. They tried all these other mics, and then they kept coming back to the 57, and it just worked for that vocalist. And you know what? It worked for him. And like, this is obviously like one of those things that like every audio engineer passes around. I don't know if it ever actually happened. It probably did, but maybe not that band or whatever. But the point is, it's not that one is better than the other. It's about using the right thing for the right situation.
Tool. I think that's the big thing.
Sometimes also, just if I want to interject here, sometimes the right tool happens to be the only tool that you have, and so you just have to use what you have. Even if it may not be the best sound, it's like, hey, this is what you have, so use what you have.
Yeah. And that applies to EQ and microphones and all kinds of things. It's like everybody fixates on, what EQ curve am I supposed to use for this? What microphone am I supposed to use for that? What placement am I supposed to use for this? And it's like it all is a tool in getting you to that. You know, it's like, what kind of hammer should I use to hit this nail? You know, to build a birdhouse. And it's like, what kind of nails do you have? And how big is the birdhouse? You know. With
that being said, we're not advocating for you to just say, whatever. I don't need to learn mic placement techniques. I don't need to learn what a decatree is or an ORTF pattern or a spaced pair or an XY pair. You should learn those things. Those Absolutely. Understanding how the standard ideas and these concepts were made and what they were used for is important. We're not saying don't learn that.
Mic placements are just like, placement of a mic is just as much a tool as the mic itself.
Yeah. And all those should be tools in your tool belt.
Right.
And I think like as standard as a hammer and a screwdriver is, you know, those two things are, you can't go to any job site. You can probably go to any job site and you can get a job done with, let's say, a handsaw, a screwdriver, and a hammer, right? Those are your three tools. You can get the jobs done with that. But if you're like, I have a chop saw, this makes this much easier. I gotta, there's all kinds of other tools that if you actually know about them, you can be like, this circumstance, it would be better to use such and such tool to accomplish the cut that I want to do or whatever. Just like, this guitar sounds like such and such. Which tool should I go to? This microphone, and I should try from this angle. And you got to try it and see how it sounds. And the same thing with EQ. Okay, what EQ do I put on this so that I can get it from here to here with the sound? And there's a bunch of different correct answers. There's a bunch of wrong ways to do it too.
And let's just put it this way. There's a lot of wrong ways to do things, and there's a bajillion right ways to do things too. There's a million ways to skin a cat, and it's not wrong. I mean, I've done microphone shootouts.
It's probably wrong nowadays.
Well, I don't know.
You get in big trouble for that.
It depends on what country you're from.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway,
no, not in our country. That'd be bad.
I think we've kind of like, beat a dead horse on this, though.
Yeah, I think we get the concept. I think the other big thing that, especially with the SM7B, is that the whole signal chain is important. We talked about acoustics. We talked about preamps. We've talked about microphones. The other part is the conversion too. But all of that, it's like there's this chain from, and then your source too. Like if you want to record a good guitar sound, you better start with a good guitar sound and a good acoustics that it's in, and then good mic placement, good microphone, good preamp, good converter, and any of those are weak. Whatever's the weakest is what's going to shine through as the quality level.
And realize that what is the weakest may not be as big of a problem. Because I was thinking about this today, because in the past we were talking about, you had mentioned that you were listening on these fancy, like super expensive monitors, Bryant, and you were like, man, these mixes suck. And they're like commercially available mixes. And I sat there and I'm like, you know what? It doesn't really matter, does it? Because they're going to be listening on somebody's car stereo. They're going to be listening on their cell phone, on, some Bluetooth speaker, and that's not saying
I didn't even like know that those mixes, quote unquote, sucked until I listened on those like $13,000 speakers. And I was like, oh, holy crap, I can hear a lot more. And you can't hear what you can't hear. But at the same time, 99% of consumers, they're not listening on $13,000 pair of speakers. they're listening on their phone. They're listening with AirPods. They're listening in their car. So
With all this background noise going on and stuff.
Well, so don't stress like if you don't have the most expensive signal chain in the world.
Yeah,
like,
I think
'cause most people probably won't even hear that.
We've discussed this before. We're not advocating that you have to spend as much money as possible to make anything that sounds good. Like, you know, going back to that 2i2 to the Scarlett, which is pretty prolific everywhere. Yes, it doesn't pair well with the SM7B, but it does pair well with a nice large diaphragm condenser that has a lot of output gain on it because it's being powered by phantom power. And so, and the preamp that's on there, the converter that's on there, and having this $100 condenser mic is still better than, you know, this $20
USB,
like,
to
USB mic
XLR.
sort of
It's
thing, you know?
I mean, but if you have a Scarlett and you do have a like SM7B and it's not what you want, you know, either sell the SM7B, get a different mic, or if you're like really set on having the SM7B, get a cloud lifter. That will definitely, you know, that will help the SM7B pair well and be a good pair with the Scarlett. That'll give you enough clean gain and clean headroom to be able to push the SM7B as needed.
Yeah, it's
Cool.
true. It's just
Any
figuring
last words?
out the correct tool. It just goes back to figuring out the correct tools. And if you pair the wrong tools, then that could be why. Like I even had a guy who had a Scarlett and he had a condenser microphone, and it just his acoustics were horrible, and so he sounded like everything he did like just sounded really roomy and bad. And so guess what I told him to do? I told him to get the trimmed down SM7B. There's like a more prosumer version of it.
Yeah.
And that he got that, and it sounds so much. And he doesn't even have a cloud lifter on it. That's the next step. We'll get the cloud lifter next. But it sounds awesome. It sounds so much better than that condenser mic because it's not picking up all that room. So, the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
All
You got
right.
anything, Bryant?
No, I think that's pretty good as far. I think we probably wrap up. You know,
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah.
Don't suck. Mix good.
mix good.